Hey guys, it's Spark, and this is the Ultimate Dynasty Warriors 8 combo guide. In this video, I'll be covering the 3-point system, elements, attack properties, and many more things. If you enjoy all the information I share throughout this video, be sure to like and subscribe. Alright, let's start off with Affinity. As we all know, Dynasty Warriors 8 introduced a system that was pretty divisive, to say the least. The Weapon Affinity system. This made it so that your weapon was either advantageous, neutral, or weak against your opponent. A rock, paper, scissors approach to combat encounters. This meant that the player would have to plan ahead of time before battle with what weapon affinity they thought was best for the given scenario. On paper, this sounds like a more strategic system that could have worked, but I think a few things stopped it from truly being enjoyable. One being hyper armor. This isn't totally new, as hyper armor has been in the series before. What comes to mind first is Dynasty Warriors Strike Force, as in this game, enemies will activate hyper armor when you approach them at times. In that game, it works as there are viable items that you can throw at your opponent to burn down their shields, and there's also elements that can just prevent them from entering that form entirely. In Dynasty Warriors 8, it can be pretty annoying as there's a guessing game aspect to it. Now, I would say that the devs made it so that the affinity weaknesses are static, so that the player would strategize as to what weapon to use on each map, but there are many officers on each map, and they all have different affinity weaknesses. It would take the player to go the extra mile to memorize them all, which is asking for a lot. With that being said, there are ways to disable affinity entirely. On the PlayStation 3 version of DW8 and 8XL, you can use a program called Brute Force. I'm going to link in the description on the Pirate's blog that goes over it. For the Steam version of Dynasty Warriors 8, you can use Fragonite's Null Affinity mod. This is how I prefer to play Dynasty Warriors 8, as now I have more room for experimenting with combos and option selection. Okay, so now let's learn how to take advantage of Affinity Shield breakage. When Affinity Shield is broken, all charge moves are untechable, and when knocked down, the officer stays on the ground for an extended period of time. As I mentioned in my past Koei Warriors guides, Charge 5 and Charge 2 are usually launchers that are techable, but with broken Affinity, this isn't much of an issue anymore. Another thing to consider, which I've mentioned in past guides, are hard knockdown states. Whenever the enemy is completely unable to retaliate or tech when being attacked, this is a true combo. I will go over this more later in the video. Do keep in mind though, for some reason the enemy falls to the ground faster when Affinity Shield is broken, so plan out what you want to do before that happens, or try to catch them before they fall. This is what I consider an option selection, choosing the best outcome for the given scenario. Now, some tips for combo practice in Dynasty Warriors 8. You can use interim saves to your advantage. When using interim saves, a broken Affinity Shield is also saved. If you so happen to drop a combo or you want to experiment, you can quit and reload your save. If you want to combo everything without much worry of the playable officer popping Musos every 7 seconds, put the ability Fear on your weapon while playing on Chaos difficulty. You will also want to play on vanilla story mode maps. For some reason, the game scales XL and DLC maps differently from the vanilla story mode maps pretty noticeably on higher difficulties. This isn't a definitive fix, but it's one that I found helps the most. Alright. In this next section, I actually want to talk about some of the more obscure information about certain attack properties. To do some grapple attacks mid-air, be sure to time them precisely at the right moment, as enemies need to be pretty close to the ground to get them to work. Generally, you should follow the don't double launch rule. I created this to help others understand the combat system in modern Muso games. What I mean by don't double launch is attacks like Charge 2 and Charge 5 tend to have the utility of knocking enemies in the air. When done twice, this will result in the enemy recovering midair or tech rolling. This rule doesn't always fit the bill, some examples being Guan Yu's Charge 5 and Liu Bei's Charge 2, but for most of the cast this does apply. It is important to note that you can alter the way these moves function, that being techable moves, by canceling them into attacks that are untechable before the enemy flips out. Examples being Cao Cao's Charge 5 into Jump Charge, Liu Bei's Charge 5 into Weapon Switch, and Joel ties air normal into charged weapon switch. Take notes of what moves are considered hard knockdowns. I went over this in a previous video as well, but it's good to elaborate on how to utilize these kinds of attacks so that you may become a true combo Andy. In fighting games, this is a force delayed wake up state the game puts you in. In Muso games, it's no different, much like how enemies will stay on the ground after you break Affinity shield. Use this to your advantage. Knock them back up into the air with a jump charge, or use a weapon switch that relaunches them. I should also mention, when using a Muso when the enemy is in this state, they are considered airborne once again. Pair this with a Muso that relaunches them, and you have many options to work with. This may seem pretty straightforward, like flame doing damage over time or frost freezing enemies, but this section of the video is to cover the more obscure stuff, and I shall try my best to give you that information. We won't go over every weapon attribute, just the ones that I feel are worth mentioning. Has a random chance at stunning your opponent. This can be pretty useful when using grapple attacks, Musos included. This can negate knockback and keep the enemy stationary for follow-up attacks. It's a weaker version of Slash, but it functions like All in some ways. Pair it with All to have an increased chance of a stun triggering. You may want to steer clear of this element if you plan on using it on the gloves, as it can make your launches fail. It causes enemies to stay in the air for longer. From my testing, you may not want to go above 4 or 5, as the enemies can feel like they're way too floaty for comboing. Great for breaking down Affinity shields, but can lower juggle height on each attack, making juggling tight to execute. The saving grace is bundling this with Morass, as it seems to negate the issue entirely. Its functionality is similar to that of All, except it puts enemies in a state of paralysis. This can be pretty useful when doing combos with setup involved. The freeze timer is a bit random though, so I would say rely on this as a backup tool. It's just like Flame, except it lowers enemies' defenses. This is great when using on weaker weapons. I tend to put these on my 3 and below gold star weapons. Can be obtained from challenge mode Inferno. This weapon attribute is pretty much essential on some weapons to give them more combo variety. It should go without saying, but this is the most important thing you can put on your weapon. Being able to get as many attacks out as possible and cutting down recovery frames. For me personally, I'm not too fond of the whirlwind passive, as it makes comboing with charge moves a little too inconsistent for my liking. What I mean by this is when, for example, doing charge 2 with Guanyin Ping, the enemy barely lifts off the ground and pretty much auto techs. Even with velocity at max, you still wouldn't be able to combo afterwards. This is why I tend to put non-whirlwind weapons on whirlwind characters. Another downside is how it conflicts with grapple moves. A good bit of grapple charges are on whirlwind weapons, so when attacking, the wind will push the enemy out of grapple range and make you whiff. This is most noticeable on gloves. When it comes to combos, ignore this. The game doesn't make the combo counter go back to 0 when messing up a juggle, but resets the chain counter when doing a Muso. In this section I want to cover some tech that will help you on your combo journey. Practice and apply these while playing, and I promise you'll find a new layer of enjoyment from the series. Some of these tips apply retrospectively too, like for example Orochi 3 in Dynasty Warriors 7. As we know with dash and speed characters, you can double jump, but what you may have not known is that you can actually jump cancel out of jump charges. To do this, you use jump charge, and when landing on the ground you hit weapon switch, and then you jump cancel out of the weapon switch. Rinse and repeat. This takes a lot of practice to get the muscle memory down, but once you do, you'll realize the combat system is way deeper than you thought. It is exactly as titled, doing an attack as early as possible while jumping. I tend to use this when playing Shaho Dune, as his air Muso has rejuggling properties built in. This isn't necessary for most weapons, but it does add a layer of spice to the mix. Learning to claw your controller mid-juggle is a boon when using this technique. Much like fighting games where you get more options when having your opponent cornered, Muso games has this as well. If you want to do an attack that has a lot of knockback to it, and not so great recovery frames, for example Zhao Yun's weapon switch, then try having your opponent at a wall while juggling them. You'll have a greater appreciation for your environment. Musos aren't just giant damage dealing AoEs, they can freeze, stun, burn, hard splat, and rejuggle opponents. Experiment with what works best with your current weapon setup. And that's about it, folks. I hope this guide gives you all the necessary tools to not only get into comboing in Dynasty Warriors 8, but the Warrior series as a whole. These games have the stigma of being called button mashers, which can be true, but you can turn these style of games almost character action-esque with enough creativity. Until next time, this is Fumaspark of the Fuma clan, returning to the shadows.